thank you all for joining us today. It's really nice to have so many people in the virtual room today. Some quick technical points. We are recording this session to make it available for others afterwards, so just to note that. And if you have questions as we go along or during the panel discussion for any of our panelists, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and we will do our best to get to them as we go along. We will also be using simultaneous translation for one of our speakers from Myanmar today. So to use this feature, you simply need to click on the globe button on the bottom of your screen, and you will hear the translation from Burmese to English. You can actually do that already, and you'll be able to hear the translation when our interpreter starts speaking. If you have any technical questions as we go along, please also pop them into the chat, and myself or my colleague Femke will try to respond to you and get back to you as soon as we can there. So for the past few years, Fairware Foundation, with our partners CNV International and Mondial FNV in the Strategic Partnership for Garment Supply Chain Transformation, have been working with Cornell University's New Conversations project to really dive into the question of what does social dialogue in the 21st century in a global garment supply chain need to look like. So as part of that, we've conducted research in 10 garment producing countries on the state, structures, and effectiveness of social dialogue. When COVID hit last year, we were actually about to publish the reports, but we decided that it was really important to monitor how the crisis impacted these social dialogue structures and how, if they in fact played an important role in how a country responded to the recovery. Of course, we know, unfortunately, we're still in the middle of the pandemic. So the research only offers a snapshot of the initial responses, but we've seen some interesting trends that can perhaps offer some insight into the important role social dialogue can take in the recovery process. We've just launched the first of these reports today, and we will put the links into the chat so you can take a further look and read, and we will also send them to you after the session via email as well. So today we will give a short overview of the key findings from this research and highlight examples from two countries, Ethiopia and Myanmar. Then we'll have a brief panel discussion with representatives from different aspects of the supply chain to see what conclusions we can draw from this research and their experiences. So I'd like to first introduce the panelists for today. First, we have Jason Judd, the Executive Director of the New Conversations Project. Jason has led work at the ILO in Bangkok, in Cambodia at Better Work, at the Fair Labor Association, the AFL-CIO, and as a labor organizer in the US. Speaking second is Samuel Andreas Admasi, who conducted the new research done in Ethiopia. He is based in Sweden and is a researcher at the International Institute of Social History in the Netherlands. From Myanmar, we're very happy and especially fortunate, given the circumstances of the last few days, to have the General Secretary of the Myanmar Industries, Craft and Services Trade Union Federation, MICS, Tet Ninh Aung. MICS was founded in 2013 and registered as a federation in 2016. It is representing workers from 9 different sectors and engaging in National Tripartite Forum, also known as NTDF, for labor law reform and improving the labor court setting. And lastly, we're pleased to have Joy Ruterdink, CSR manager from the Dutch garment brand Suit Supply, joining us from the Netherlands. Suit Supply has been a Fairware member since 2007 and is rated in its leader category since 2016. Currently, 54% of its supply base is organized in bodies, committees, or unions, and in almost 60% of factories they source from, a collective bargaining agreement is applied. So welcome to all of our panelists. Thanks so much for joining us today. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Jason to get us started. Jason.
Thanks, Tina. Well, as you said, there's a lot going on. We thought we'd start with the basics. What is social dialogue? Why does it matter? And for that, I turned to the ILO's definition. And if you look on the left, you see what the ILO says social dialogue should include. and gosh, everything's in there: negotiation, consultation, collective bargaining, dispute resolution, workplace cooperation, international framework agreements. And I read that and I thought, wow, that's a big tent. There's room in there for everything. And then if you read the preconditions for sound social dialogue on the right, the tent starts getting smaller: strong, independent, representative employers and worker organizations with the technical capacity, political will, trust, respect for fundamental rights. That big tent gets small pretty quickly. So using that column on the left as our definition of social dialogue, we decided collectively, all of us, that we would map social dialogue because of the changes that have happened, not just in the last 10 years, but in the last 100 years. The goal was to figure out in social dialogue, in apparel now, who's in and who's out, who's missing, and just as important, what's going on inside. What's the quality of the social dialogue? Is it sound, as the ILO says? Is it productive? Why not? So this is first a mapping exercise, and we knew that we had to put the new players on the board. The social dialogue system designed 100 years ago, employers, unions, governments, just doesn't suit anymore. It doesn't take account of the huge power imbalances between global brands and their local suppliers, or the distance that's both literal and figurative between brands and the workers who make their products. So in these reports, the synthesis that we've written and the 10 country reports, we're mapping the interests and the roles of this now larger, more complex network of actors at every level: the factory level, the sectoral level, national, global. We're looking not just at social dialogue in the countries in which the work is done, but also social dialogue at the global level that involves governments, not just home to suppliers, but governments that are home to retailers and brands. That was the first task. And then the second was to get into, explore the diversity of the legal frameworks. They're sort of all over the place. This group of 10 countries are in some ways very different. What are the habits of social dialogue and democratic interaction? How are industrial relations understood and practiced? How much coordination is there amongst suppliers, governments, unions? So it's all in there. And then the last question: is it bona fide? Is social dialogue conducted in good faith? Because we know that all social dialogue is not equal. So we want to distinguish between social dialogue habits that are consistently democratic, that are inclusive, that are conducted in good faith, that are productive, and those that are not, those that are ritualistic. Okay, so what did we find? Well, the first pattern is that there's not really a pattern. Patterns are hard to find across these 10 countries, but we've developed a couple of typologies, categories in the paper to help make sense of the different habits and practices in these 10 countries. I'm going to share just a couple of them with you to give you a taste of it, and you need to go into the synthesis report to see more of this. I thought we'd share first. I can get to it. There we go. One of the typologies that we use in the paper, it's the state role in social dialogue. What's the relationship chiefly between the state and the unions? And here we break the 10 countries into 4 types. First, well, let me start with polarized, where the labor movements are active but struggling. In Cambodia and Indonesia, both good examples of this. Subsidiary, where the apparel industry is king, where it dominates export, the export economy, for example, and the employers are very powerful, both in relationship to the unions and to the government. Bangladesh, Cambodia are good examples. Cooperative, where there's longstanding structures or habits of social dialogue. Bulgaria sort of brought forward its tradition from that dates back to the Soviet era. Honduras is another example. There, the habits of social dialogue are the product of long struggles between workers and employers, and consistent attention and pressure on the international buyers from campaigners, both inside Honduras and outside. And then fluctuating, which sort of speaks for itself, is a mix. But in that group, watch Mexico, for example. It gets an asterisk in this table, where, like Cambodia 20 years ago, a new trade agreement, this one with the U.S. and Canada, makes new specific demands on the Mexican government to improve freedom of association, collective bargaining systems, and introduce new protections, new and more meaningful protections for activists and unions. If you're interested in Mexico, be sure to read the report that's going up on the site. It goes into all this in great detail. And that's true for all of this, these typologies, the stories, the development of social dialogue. There's a lot in the synthesis, but there's a lot more in the individual country reports. Okay, so second example, what's changed in the pandemic? How did these social dialogue systems perform under pressure? So we found in the special reports, the COVID addenda that we collected from researchers last year, that about half of the systems, half of the countries in the report had social dialogue systems that we describe as functional. We don't want to oversell it. Functional means not necessarily strong, not necessarily sound, but working at a basic level. And those, in fact, include the two examples that we're going to take up next, Ethiopia and Myanmar, both places with profound political crises today, but nonetheless, functional social dialogue structures in the response to COVID. In Bangladesh and Mexico and Vietnam, the COVID social dialogue was what we call ritualistic. So it's not really focused on cooperation or results. The parties were largely going through the motions. In India and Cambodia and Indonesia, we watched the government and the employers take advantage of the crisis to get something they'd been after, specifically pro-employer rules, or in the case of Cambodia, putting off a regular, a routine, a scheduled revision of minimum wage for garment workers. So we call these obviously opportunistic. And the synthesis report and the country reports will give you a lot more detail. Okay, last, what are some of the obstacles? What gets in the way of productive social dialogue? Well, first, let's talk about freedom of association, because practically, universally, buyers write freedom of association and respect for the right of workers and unions to bargain collectively. They write that into their codes. That's one of their values. But sometimes it's just rhetorical. They don't figure how to act it out, and it's certainly not acted out in many of the brands that we know and follow by their sourcing departments, the people who make decisions about where the work gets done. They don't value or even understand social dialogue, and by pushing cost and risk down to suppliers, they effectively make social dialogue harder. That's pressure on wages, that's pressure to make improvements to factories. More work ends up getting subcontracted. Those are all things that make social dialogue more difficult. And again, there's a long discussion of that in the synthesis paper. Okay, so that's first. Second is there's a supply problem. There just aren't enough bona fide activist factory level or sectoral unions to go around in the global garment trade. And there's even a shorter still supply of suppliers, of employers willing to deal with organized workers. So why does that matter? Well, borrowing from research that our project, the New Conversations project, has done elsewhere, we took Better Work data from across that group of countries and looked at the difference between labor compliance, factory level working conditions compliance in a factory or in factories that have a union and a collective bargaining agreement, and compared that with factories that don't have either, have no union, no collective bargaining agreement. And the difference is significant. It's there on your table. It's the difference between 91% compliance and 82% compliance between those two types of factories. That's why social dialogue matters. But here's the problem. in a lot of the places in which the world's apparel gets made, you'll see them in red there through much of Asia, freedom of association is either not a thing, it's not allowed by law, or it's not effective, it's not sound, it's not real. And then we took a look at the sourcing practices. Remember sourcing, the role they play in this. We looked at the sourcing practices of the brands, and they are sourcing predominantly from places where freedom of association is either not a thing or it's not real. We've got here just 3 examples: Gap, Primark, and H&M. And then, one more slide, we took a look at what happens in the audit process. So even if a brand is committed to engaging in factories or sectors, countries where freedom of association is real, how good are the audit practices at picking up freedom of association? This graph shows all of the violations identified by audits. This is from a leading global retailer. Only 0.4% of the violations belong to freedom of association. And we know from experience that that's just not the case. There are many, many more violations of freedom of association, but audits don't pick up on it. So all of that together is what we call the problem of supply. Okay, so that was a brief tour of the synthesis report and what we mean when we say social dialogue, who the players are, what gets in the way. Over to you, Tina.
Great, thanks, Jason. That's a very quick but great overview of some of the findings we had in the synthesis report and really the challenges that social dialogue in this industry face. Next up, we want to zoom in a little bit and take a look at some of the findings from our country study on Ethiopia. So Andreas, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Tina. Let me try to get PowerPoint up there. Is it visible?
Yeah, but maybe just toggle your display settings to full screen. Perfect.
Is that better? Great. Okay, great. Well, okay, so first of all, since this report was written, Ethiopia has descended into war. And I think what is important to say in that respect overall is, of course, that beyond social dialogue and the textile industry, that there is currently intense human suffering and dislocation in Ethiopia's northern Tigray region. There have been reports of unspeakable atrocities and human rights abuse, even famine. But that aside, the situation also includes a deterioration in the conditions of the textile and garment industry and the conditions of workers, as well as the economy in general. The scale of destruction that the war has entailed is quite astonishing. And one of the outcomes is the reduction of the Tigrayan economy to rubbles. And this includes its textile industry, which was quite important, well, at least within an Ethiopian context. Most, if not all factories in Tigray are currently inoperational. One large textile factory has been completely destroyed. It has been looted and it simply exists no longer. And others too have reported looting. Hundreds of foreign managers and staff have already left. And yes, what we know from the workers there is little because of the communication ban. But what we hear is worrying. And it seems highly optimistic to believe that the turmoil and the economic fallout will be confined to Tigray alone. For one, because the reputation among investors of Ethiopia as a relatively stable country is, of course, severely damaged. But the research behind this report was carried out before this turn for the worse. Things were looking somewhat more hopeful, but even the baseline then in Ethiopia was not particularly good, at least not for textile workers. I think many of you have probably heard about the low levels of wages in the Ethiopian textile industry. They are frequently as low as $25 per month, well below the cost of social reproduction, also even below the costs of individual upkeeps of the workers, which means that in many cases from agriculture or from relatives abroad, and so on and so forth. And what the pandemic has also shown is that in many, particularly in foreign enterprises, the baseline salary was even lower than $25. So when bonuses and allowances has been removed, they have been left to fend with even less than that. And so interestingly, the situation is and has been worse in the more productive, more profitable export-oriented and newer export-oriented plants.
I think it's
than in the older enterprises.
Andreas, it's a bit difficult to hear you.
Okay, perhaps if I sit a bit closer.
Your connection is cutting out, so maybe turn your video off and see, maybe that will help a bit.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, you can still hear me, right?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Thanks, you're back.
Right.
So Andreas,
yes.
could you maybe repeat the last few sentences, as we didn't hear the last few sentences, as Lisa Suarez already said in her chat. Thank you very much.
Right. Okay. So I was speaking about the wages and the very low wages in the Ethiopian textile industry, and the curiosity that the wages are generally typically lower in the new foreign-owned plants that are producing for an export market than in the older, less profitable and less productive Ethiopian-owned plants. And so also in the industrial parks, wages and conditions are often poorer. And this has also had an implication on conditions during the COVID pandemic, because we have also seen that whereas large parts of the incomes of workers in the parks have been scaled off, since they consist of bonuses and allowances, that has not occurred to the same extent in the domestic-owned firms, since the baseline salaries contribute to a larger share of the wages. So perhaps I need to speed this up a little bit. What I've been touching upon also in the report is also the fact that unions are prevented from operating in some of the industrial parks and many foreign-owned plants to a much higher extent than in the Ethiopian-owned plants. And with that, of course, enterprise-level social dialogue and the sort of pressures that has actually worked to improve wages and conditions elsewhere in Ethiopia in the past. But despite these infringements on the freedom of association, on the whole, there has been a resurgence of unions and their capacity since the mid-2010s in Ethiopia. Among other things, it has expressed itself in their ability to significantly influence the new labor law, among other things by means of a threat of a general strike in 2019. And of course, they are looking forward to being part of a minimum wage board that was established in this law, but which has not been instituted yet. And they were also, before the COVID pandemic struck, looking forward to a sustained campaign to break this illegal ban on unions in some of the industrial parks. So this revitalization of unions can be expressed also in terms of memberships of the unions, which has grown from 300,000 in 2014 to around 750,000 last year. And also in the resurgence of industrial contention, with wildcat strikes occurring across the waged economy. And this has also then refocused attention of employers and the government on the unions as a necessary social partner. It has strengthened understanding of the need for social dialogue. Well, then the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, has also revealed the importance of social dialogue. And if there indeed was a stress test, as we said in the abstract of this panel, then Ethiopia, in that respect, respect, actually performed surprisingly good. There was close engagement and dialogue on how to handle the situation from the outset. There was sustained tripartite engagement and dialogue, which has been important in order to resolve and mitigate problems generated by the pandemic at both national and workplace levels. And at the same time, the problems posed have generated even a closer need for closer engagements. And the solutions themselves, such as the institutions that have been set up, the ad hoc institutions, have generated new spaces for social dialogue. So at the national level, intense dialogue commenced pretty much immediately, and a COVID-19 workplace protocol was drafted and negotiated and agreed upon by the tripartite constituents. I will not go into the details of the COVID protocol, but in combination with the state of emergency proclamation that came at around the same time, it meant effectively that it became impossible for employers to retrench workers without having negotiated this with the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs and the workers' organizations. So for that reason, in the formal sector, including the textile sectors, we have seen very, very few retrenchments. But that, of course, has not meant that salaries have not decreased overall, because again, of bonuses and allowances being shaved off. And again, this is predominantly the case in the foreign-owned plants and in the industrial parks. And then probably one thing that ought to be noted also, that in enterprises with unions, there has been close consultation on joint preparedness and prevention activities, on managing the impact of the pandemic, and the modification of working conditions that has been necessary. And this has occurred in most plants with unions, whereas where there has not been unions, of course, it has been difficult. And there are many direct benefits also accruing to the employees of the unionist workplaces from the union's role in preventing outbreaks and mitigating effects of the pandemic. Unions have, for instance, effectively disseminated the information among workers, and they have picked up and relayed information back on inconsistencies and violations of the protocol. So trade unions are frequently the first to inform factory management, federations and authorities when there are local outbreaks at the factory, and in that way ensuring that mass testing of staff occurs. And federations have also conducted factory visits to make sure that they have complied with the protocol. Also, management at unionized workplaces tend to be better at following protocol agreement provisions and at providing personal protective equipment. And there has also been subsidies in some cases where there have been unions, particularly again in the domestic industries, to workers affected. And this, of course, contrasts quite starkly with ununionized textile factories in, for example, the flagship Hawassa Industrial Park, where the removal of bonuses and benefits have led to sharp cuts in pay. So if I can illustrate this with one example, this relationship between social dialogue and the existence of unions on the one hand, and the outcomes in terms of this pandemic on the other one, that is a particularly serious outbreak of COVID-19 that occurred in Bolelemi Industrial Park in July and August 2020, where 278 workers became ill. And the outbreak originated in Shin's garment factory, which is owned by the Korean company Shin Textile Solutions, and it employs some 1,400 workers. And Shin's had already been known for its union busting practices, and this probably contributed to the late response. On July 25, for instance, Industrial wrote to the Korean mother company and condemned it for actively discouraging workers from joining the union, harassing union members and leaders, stopping the union from holding a meeting at the factory, and not collecting union dues and surrendering them to the union as per labor laws in the Ethiopian factory. And because of these repressive practices, the basic union membership had already dropped from 3,800 to 2,500. And the union therefore holds that health and safety and COVID-19 preventive work was undermined at the factory. So there is a direct relationship between these illegal practices and the ability of plants to respond to the concrete challenges of the pandemic. I won't go very much further. There are, of course, other aspects also relating to to the economy and the Ethiopian textile industry's place in it. But what one can say overall is that this far, at least, the government has appeared to be responsive to the needs of both labor and capital within the setting of the pandemic. And tripartite and bipartite social dialogue has been useful in overcoming problems, finding mutually acceptable solutions. But of course, the ills that already plague the sector, and particularly the tolerance of illegal practices by the newly established foreign-owned plants, continues to constitute a problem which also has ripple effects within this pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. Yeah, it's very interesting that what this research showed, that despite the challenging situation in Ethiopia beforehand, we did actually see a lot of positive examples coming out of it. So the report has a lot of really interesting information. It goes into much more details of what Andreas was sharing there as well. Next up, we feel very fortunate to have the union leader Tet Min Aung with us today to share his experiences from Myanmar. And of course, the events of the past 2 days in Myanmar are still actively playing out, and we want to offer our support and solidarity to all of our colleagues and workers in Myanmar right now. And of course, want to acknowledge that these recent events will surely have an impact on the social dialogue structures in Myanmar, and the experiences shared today might change significantly moving forward, of course. A reminder to participants, the next part will have interpretation for, so you can switch on the interpretation at the bottom of your screen from Burmese to English, and you'll be able to hear. Tet Min Aung, the floor is yours. Welcome.
And now, Myanmar, I will interpret. Yes, Jare. You can hear a lot of noise. This is, the military dictatorship, the against. You can hear, very loud. This is the against dictatorship by hitting like this. So peacefully, but the against. So from, although there is the noise, I will try to interpret now what he speaks. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Hello,
Everybody, we say good time to you, Mingla. So I am from Myanmar. So, at the same time, when I'm saying, so our leaders are now arrested and detained in what I am discussing. So you see, under this, bad situations of this military dictatorship, again, in Myanmar, so the tripartite, we have started since 2015. So in 2015, with the employers and employee, and then we make for the mutual benefits, and with the wages, and then for the employment contracts, and with like minimum wages, we make the social dialogue, and then we have made the national level, minimum wages standard. And then now under the COVID period, so this we tripartite talk, and then we tried for that. So we have, overcome the COVID-19 first wave. But in the COVID-19 second wave, for the minimum wages reviewing, but so to respond with these COVID-19 conditions, but employers, they cannot, follow the COVID-19, this kind of the minimum wages standards, regulations. But the employers are quite eager to do, but because of this situation, and yesterday, and then the military arrested our leaders and MPs. So now this is the military, government. So I am really worried about that. The, pressure on our trade unions and our worker leaders. So that's why, the military said we cannot take part in that kind of, this kind of conference or So social dialogue, they say that for these kind of activities, military said, so you cannot take part in that kind of social dialogue or the discussions. So however, we are willing to hold for these social dialogues. Yes. And the next one thing is, and the FOA, Freedom of Association, since 2010, we have started FOA, and according to the labor organization law, at the factory levels, we can form at the factory levels. And when we form the labor organizations, there are many activities. So they opposed our labor organization activities, but our MICS, we tried to organize, and then we were, recognized. And there are challenges. So you can see here challenges. So there were, targeted our workers, union activists, and then some are dismissed and targeted. So, and during, COVID-19, so the social dialogue from the employer side and government side. So during this COVID-19, so the dismissal and then some of the salary cuttage, we have sorted out that. And then there are some of these, over the 67,800, this kind of injuries. So we try to obtain their fair justice. Then, there were mostly from the garment industry and migrant workers, and then consumer grocery like food shoes. And then this is because of COVID-19, there are some of the, impacts. But however, the laborers to perform continuously about these labor activities. And then Smart EU, there are vulnerable, groups. And then we try to support these vulnerable groups. And then as you see in the slides, for the responsibility, what we are now doing here, and we will, try to increase some of our responsibility to be able to settle of these problems. And then there are some of the weakness of this mechanism for the disputes resolution. So then if the brand can involve for this kind of dispute resolution, then it will be very effective, I believe.
Great. Thank you very much, Tetming Aung. I really appreciate that perspective. From Myanmar, looking at how the unions have come together to support workers during the crisis of COVID, and actually now looking forward, how the unions can play a role at the moment or see what's possible moving forward as well. We wanted to now go and get the perspective from the other side of the supply chain, and that's from one of our brands, Joy from Suit Supply is joining us now. And I wanted to ask Joy, as a brand sourcing from various countries globally, including Myanmar, I know, who has previously been working with suppliers on improving social dialogue at the workplace, what's your reaction to this research and to the examples we have from Ethiopia and Myanmar? And is it accurate and reflective of what you've experienced as a brand during COVID?
Thanks, Tina, for the question. Well, I mean, to start with, like, I actually would like to give a sort of quick reply to what Jason actually, before these two research actually mentioned. And I can, from the brand perspective, I can fully agree with that. It's social dialogue, freedom of association, collective bargaining is a huge topic, and it's sometimes very unclear for brands to understand what its role can be or should be in it, especially since audits almost never pick any issues, at least up when it comes to these topics. And therefore for brands, it's often very difficult to figure out what exactly is going on. And then, of course, social dialogue and collective bargaining, it's a whole spectrum. It's, you have really low level social dialogue, which is very simply between workers and their employers, or between workers and brands through grievance mechanisms, or factories, of course, and brands that obviously have a lot of conversations going on. And that is definitely something that at Suit Supply we focus on. I heard Ted mentioning as well that dispute handling is, when done by brands or when brands are involved in that, can be very effective to get things sorted out. And I can fully agree with that, both in Myanmar, but actually in all countries where grievance mechanisms are available. We of course use the very one in 13 countries where you guys are active, but also in other countries we have our own mechanism, which is a great way to kind of bridge language barriers and all kinds of issues that you would normally have when, as a brand, you're dealing with so many different countries and so many different factories potentially, and you just cannot have a one-on-one conversation with each and every single person in it. But it's a great way to really, when effective, of course, to sort of keep a finger at the pulse to understand if things are going on. When it comes to the Ethiopia example, I really liked I really disliked the mention of the fact that especially foreign companies who are investing in Ethiopia and are setting up textile factories are putting their wages lower than local factories. I think that's a very terrible thing. And I think despite the fact that as a brand, we do not source from Ethiopia, I think it's a very clear warning for all of us that we should not be naive about these huge, big, shiny foreign factories often. And that it's really something that should be on the agenda of brands to really ask, to really understand if any structures are in place, or if factories are, speaking about those things with their workers or with local unions, or how potentially relationships are. And I think another really concrete thing, which I also heard mentioned before by Ted in this case again, and that is about contracts, worker contracts. So I think it's a very good concrete point for any brand to get involved in. Also something that you can actually get from an audit report, or you can get from speaking to companies and to factories, like to really understand how many, if at all, there are any temporary contracts, what percentage of the workforce is on temporary contracts. And it's, I think, especially during COVID and after COVID, it's a very important thing to pay attention to, because workers under temporary contracts are in an extremely weak position to bargain for anything, to have a strong position to collectively bargain or social dialogue or do anything for that matter. And it can be a direct consequence of buying practices, of relationships that brands have with their workers or with their factories. So I think that's a very important thing to look out for as well.
Great. Thanks, Joy, so much for sharing that perspective too, and responding to what the others and what the research has said as well. I wanted to sort of ask a few questions now, and we have a couple questions popping in from the audience as well. But first, I wanted to ask Tet Min Aung. He also mentioned the role of brands, and Joy, you just addressed it a bit as well. But as Jason said before, we've had this, 20 years of codes of conducts, and where brands have had freedom of association, social dialogue in their on their radar, and we've seen really mixed results from that as well. So what would you say, what is the right role of brands? And given what we've heard from Joy, what are the right triggers that brands can pull? What are the right things brands can do to, for example, support the local unions or to support social dialogue in their supply chains?
Yes, as a brand, yes, okay, brands, yeah. So mainly, and between employers. So these contracts, and then must be transparent. In Myanmar, we want to be transparent. What are the contracts between employers and the brands? Some of the factories, so some factories even they don't inform what brand they are making, So that's why want the brand's help is necessary, you know, so that's, and then when the brands, they do audit with the, to meet with the real, you know, leaders of the workers, many factories, so they were, you know, formed by the employers. Some of the representatives are selected by the employers. That's why I would like to urge, you know, to interview with the real workers representative, you know, some they target and dismissal. If they interview with brand, the employer, you know, dismiss that kind of workers representative. That's why we need to be really careful, and then we would like to get brands cooperation for that.
Great. Thank you very much for sharing that. And Joy, I just want to come back to you on that. So as a brand, you know, can you meet with the leaders directly of the workers? What does that look like for a brand? Is that possible?
I mean, I'm not going to say that it's in all cases extremely easy, but what Ted is saying is absolutely true. It is possible, and often it is possible when you potentially have a local office with people that speak the local language. Then you can do it actually on your own, go into the factory and have a meeting with some workers, amongst workers that belong to, that are potentially trade union members or belong to the local worker representation or the committee that is in place in that factory, whatever that might look like. So I fully agree with that. I feel that during certain more like high quality audits, that's actually already sort of included, where audits leaders or the auditors will actually already ask the factory and the brand potentially who is available or on site if it's okay if the if someone from worker representation can join in the exit meeting, and for them to be actually involved in the corrective actions that might come out of that audit as well. And it's a very sort of nice and effective way to really involve workers in improving their facilities, because, you know, in the end, it's really not about us as brands to tell them what they should do. But it's absolutely, it would be absolutely great if through involving workers and through starting that dialogue to really empower them to actually help and make those decisions with us as well. And with the last point about transparency, yeah, again, I fully agree. I feel FARA members are relatively transparent. You can find actually all factories on the website, and I think a lot of factories, I mean, it's still very common for factories to be very secretive about what brands they make. It's kind of a sort of a negative old habit of the industry, I feel. But yeah, there should be actually no reason to. But I also think that for factories, sometimes it can be very scary if brands are directly approached or directly involved with trade unions that might be locally available. So, and I think as well as brands have a huge role in that too, because you should really mention and discuss things and understand why that could potentially be an issue if there is an issue. So yeah, really starting that conversation, trying to involve workers as much as you can. How difficult that might be, there is always a way. Yeah, and that can only improve.
Great, thanks, Joy. Yeah, it's really good to hear also from the brand perspective. I don't think anything about this is easy on any level. We've seen, you know, from the research Jason presented that it's not easy for trade unions or suppliers or brands, but the what you reinforce there, that the brands can make an effort and take this on, is good. Andreas, we had a question from Yurki Reina, and he said, Ethiopia doesn't have a legal minimum wage in the private sector, and typical salaries in the garment sector could be as low as 30 to 50 US per month, like you mentioned. Has social dialogue and collective bargaining led to any better results at company level, especially as Western fashion brands are involved, and especially since, you know, you mentioned that you often see exports brands having worse conditions?
Well, yes. Well, Ethiopia doesn't have a set minimum wage in the private sector. It has the legal provisions for a minimum wage since the summer of 2019, and the institution of minimum wage setting board is established in that law. Of course, the political turmoil that happened after that has delayed this. But what trade unions and employers' organizations are preparing for is the setting of a minimum wage through this tripartite wage board now. and social dialogue and collective bargaining. Certainly, it has been important in making this differentiated landscape of wages that the Ethiopian wage sector is. And where you have, again, where you have free trade unions, not yellow trade unions, not workers' committees set up by the employers, you have a relatively better situation. So certainly, I think that the most important thing in Ethiopia right now are the basics, that the freedom of association is respected, and that the minimum wage is set at a substantial level. If that happens, there is both a tradition in Ethiopia and a capable movement that can protect workers' interests to such an extent that we won't have to see these ridiculous salaries that we do now. Because even $50 as an incoming salary in most factories is very, very high. That is not something we see in many places. And may I just say in that context also that, of course, when it comes to what brands can do, of course, there are brands that have decided to work outside of the parks with Ethiopian-owned plants and so on, probably because conditions are often better in those places. But then again, there is an active decision involved in the selection there, because once you select to source from parks where you know that the legal freedom of association is not just undermined, but absent, where you know that there is a cartel working that are setting wages at the rock bottom level, you have already more or less made that active choice to that other prerogatives are more important than the conditions of the workers. But of course, that doesn't go for all brands, and there are brands that have been sourcing from factories where there are better conditions.
Great, thank you, Andreas. We have another question from Samia, and I'll address this to Tetning Aun. She's interested to know of how social dialogue may result in backlash, particularly against workers or trade unions, and particularly during the COVID crisis. Did you see this in your own work?
Okay.
Social dialogue.
Yes, the social dialogue. There are two, types. One is the factory level social dialogue. The factory level social dialogue. So we discussed bipartite, the employers and the employees, these kind of bipartites. So some employers, so they are very weak to comply the law. So sometimes bipartite, so employers said, we disagree what the demand of the workers. So some, are not, the social discussion is not going well, but the next type of discussion is tripartite. This is the national level. This is national level. In this national level, the social dialogue, so the employers and the employees and the government representative. So yes, that's why the government, government sector representative, then employers, and then the government side is the labor ministries, and then the employer side is like the industrial association. So we discussed, like, for example, in the tripartite, like the minimum wages or some of the legislation reforms, we make the social dialogue forum. We call the national tripartite forum. We discuss about the wages and then some of the legislation amendments. Then we also, monitor all of our agreements are doing well or not. We make some of the monitoring of this kind of our agreements.
Right, thank you. Yeah, I think it is important also to recognize there is social dialogue at these different levels. And actually, we probably do see, I know from our own experience, yes, that sometimes that those different social dialogue levels, workers do face discrimination. And it's why we really need to ensure that these rights of freedom of association, the right of collective bargaining, are enshrined and protected in labor laws as well, so that unionists can also do their work. Now, I'm cognizant of the time, although we have more questions we'd like to go through, but I wanted to just take a moment to ask a question of all the panelists here. So let's assume that we will see another crisis like COVID or an economic crisis or a crisis of any kind in 3 years or 5 years from now, and that perhaps this is the new normal that we're working in. What should we all do right now to build for this crisis? And Joy, I'm going to start with you.
I already thought you'd do that. No worries. I think that at least from a brand perspective, we should really analyze our supply chains. We should really analyze our own practices and really see where the weak spots are. I think that COVID's been in that way a great learning school for a lot of us. And I think it's very important. I mean, when we talk about working on social monitoring and this being a huge important part of it as well, I always say to a lot of people that, you know, it doesn't start with how good your factories are. It actually starts with how good your own practices are. Like, how are prices negotiated with suppliers? Will they have actually any say about how prices are formulated? You know, is there any price transparency when you negotiate new prices? Do you understand what the actual price is of production? But also payment terms. You know, how are your payment terms with your suppliers? Are they awfully short, or do you allow for them to pay a bit later? You know, instead of a 30-day payment term, can it be a 60 or 90-day, depending on whatever you've agreed on? Then I would also say production planning. Again,
Can I say one thing? We don't have a lot of time, so.
Sorry. Yes, I'll make it short.
Thank you.
I'll try to make it short. Basically, I think it's really about understanding what your own practices are, understanding the disruptions in supply chains, and actually also see if you can consolidate your supply chain to really focus on suppliers. Yeah, that you can basically, you really know where your things are coming from, to really understand that you have a low tail end, so there's not a lot of tiny suppliers where you mean nothing to them or they mean nothing to you. And supplier contracts. I know it's very uncommon in the business, but it really gives suppliers perspective, but as well as the brands. You know, it's a partnership, but it's not an extraction channel. So
Right.
That would be my few things.
Great, thanks, Joy. Andreas, in 30 seconds or less, what should we do right now?
Yeah, so I think that actually that the social dialogue and the measures taken by the government in Ethiopia has actually worked fairly well. And it has prevented the pandemic from destroying the livelihoods of most workers. But then, of course, not at the workplace level. It's not always the case. It's very uneven, as we have seen. And that problem is older, and it has to do with the tacit approval of illegal practices. So I think that from the perspective of workers, what needs to be done is to address the basics, and that is freedom of association and collective bargaining then in the industrial parks, but also the setting of an overall minimum wage, which is substantial and which is not degraded by inflation.
Great, thank you. And Tetnin Aung, same question to you. What should we do right now to prepare for this again?
Yes. So as for the brands, so this regarding to COVID-19, so at the factories, so there are instructions from the Ministry of Health. So we want the pay attention on the what are the health instructions, because our workers, you know, the safety, especially the, you know, health safety, there are many risks because of this COVID-19. So not to accept the risky factories of health risk, you know, factories. So for this response, how the factories are complying with the health instruction by the Ministry of Health or the COVID committee of the state. So that brand should check for the health and safety of the workers, how they comply, you know, these instructions for the workers' safety.
Great, thank you.
And
Jason, lastly, over to you. What should we do?
Well, 4 things really fast. One is sourcing matters. We've talked about that. factory level, sectoral level, national level. Brands have got to tune into this, those that aren't. Second, trade matters. When a trading partner says to another government, social dialogue at the factory level, a commitment to sectoral bargaining, bona fide national social dialogue, all those things matter to us. They're in our agreement. The industry and the national government tunes in. Third, we've got to pay attention to this vast imbalance between workers, employers on one end, and brands on the other. The power imbalance is radical, and this abuse of the force majeure clause in contracts, canceling of orders makes this more obvious than ever. The last thing I wanted to say is that I mean, we can literally hear the crackdown in the street in Myanmar. So I want to recognize the powerful stories of struggle and offer that as sort of an ultimate stress test, not just for workers and unions in Myanmar, but for the employers. Which way are they going to go? For unions, which way are they going to go? And for trading partners, how are they going to insist on bona fide social dialogue to get their way through this crisis and send a signal to the leaders of this coup that this won't stand, and this clashes with our values. This is a brand speaking. Our values as a brand that is committed to freedom of association and the democratic practice of social dialogue. Be watching closely.
Thanks, Jason. I think that's an important and great note to end on. So I just want to say thank you to all the panelists and participants for joining, and of course to the OECD for hosting this forum. There's a lot of other great sessions happening this week that I think are really important for all of us to tune into. We're excited that we've just entered a new 5-year program called Stitch with our partners at Mondial FNV, CNV International, the Ethical Trading Initiative, CIVIDEP, and CDI Vietnam, where we'll continue to explore these questions, work with brands, other stakeholders, partners such as Cornell, to promote the role of social dialogue as key to improvements in the industry based on democratic participation of workers. You can find a lot more resources on social dialogue on our website at Fairware Foundation, at Cornell and the New Conversations Project, as well as CNV and FNV websites as well. And we'll be sending out links via email in the next few days with all the research reports and the overall synthesis reports that go a lot more into detail in our research as well. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating. We hope you enjoyed.
Thank you, Tina.
Thanks.